The first light did not die quietly. It snapped above the ballroom with a sharp, glassy pop, bright enough to make half the room look up and cold enough to make the other half pretend not to notice. For 1 second, the crystal chandelier over Hale Tower's winter charity gala flickered like it had changed its mind about staying alive, then steadied again, throwing gold across tuxedos, diamonds, and champagne flutes as if nothing had happened. But Elijah Brooks noticed. He always noticed. He stood near the west wall with a gray mop handle in one hand and a folded rag tucked into his back pocket, his janitor badge catching a thin stripe of light every time guests drifted past him without seeing his face. The marble under his shoes still held the damp shine from his last pass, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and old stone, and the soft jazz from the live quartet floated through the room like money trying to sound warm. Elijah tilted his head just slightly. Somewhere above the ceiling panels, behind the polished beams and decorative molding, the building gave off a sound most people would never hear, a strained electric hum, thin and sharp, like a wire being pulled too tight. He looked toward the lighting truss over the stage. Too many rentals. Too much load. Too much heat hiding behind beautiful things. A waiter brushed past him with a silver tray. A woman in a sequined navy gown stepped around his mop without glancing down. 2 men near the bar laughed over a market joke that made no sense to anyone outside their tax bracket. Elijah moved toward a fresh spill near the center aisle, quiet as shadow, shoulders squared, eyes still tracking the ceiling. Then the voice came, clean and cutting. Eyes down. Mop. The words were not shouted, which somehow made them travel farther. Grant Holloway, director of operations, stood 10 feet away in a midnight suit that fit like a threat, one hand adjusting his cuff while the other held a tablet full of schedules, names, and invisible hierarchies. His smile never fully formed. It never had to. He was the kind of man who knew exactly how little volume it took to embarrass someone in public. A few nearby guests turned just enough to catch the exchange, their attention brightening with that brief guilty spark people get when humiliation arrives dressed as entertainment. Elijah lowered his gaze to the spill, but not before his eyes flicked once more to the chandelier. It pulsed again. Tiny. Wrong. He set the mop head down and drew the wet line back across the marble. Careful, measured, almost gentle. Grant stepped closer, his loafers stopping just short of the clean path. We have donors from 3 states in this room tonight, he said, low enough to sound controlled, loud enough to be heard. The last thing I need is staff wandering around looking confused. Elijah wrung the mop once, the metal handle cool in his hand. Sir, he said, keeping his voice even, the stage lights on the east side are pulling too hard. There may be an overload in the auxiliary panel. Grant looked at him as if the sentence itself were offensive. Then he let out one breath through his nose, almost a laugh, and glanced at the guests nearest him, inviting them to share the joke without saying it. You hear that? He said. Our janitor thinks he's an engineer. Elijah did not answer. The quartet kept playing. Glasses clinked. Perfume and floor polish mixed in the air. Overhead, the chandelier shimmered once more, just long enough to make the gold on the walls tremble. And this time, Elijah felt the building flinch. Elijah kept the mop moving because that was what invisible men did in rooms like this. They moved, they cleaned, they disappeared. The ballroom around him shimmered like a snow globe built for rich people who never had to touch the glass. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline in blue-black winter, 34 stories up, where the city looked less like a place people lived and more like a field of diamonds laid out for purchase. Candlelight trembled inside cut crystal holders on the cocktail tables. Silver trays drifted past with crab cakes, smoked salmon, and tiny desserts no one finished. Every polished surface threw back some version of the same image. White collars, dark suits, satin gowns, teeth too bright under designer lipstick. All of it floating above the marble Elijah had scrubbed twice that afternoon on his hands and knees. The quartet by the stage had eased into something slower now. Soft piano under a brushed snare, the kind of music meant to make power sound effortless. But the room did not feel effortless to Elijah. It felt strained, too bright, too hot behind the walls, too full of borrowed light. He passed the mirrored bar and caught his reflection between rows of champagne flutes. A tall black man in a maintenance uniform, shoulders broad from years of work, expression unreadable, badge clipped straight over his chest like a reminder of what this room had already decided he was. A server reached across him without apology. Two guests stepped into his path without seeing him at all. One man, pink-faced and silver-haired, lifted his drink and said to his companion, not quietly enough, "These buildings run on people you never have to remember." The companion smiled into his bourbon as if that were wisdom instead of cruelty. Elijah said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that silence was not always surrender. Sometimes it was storage. Sometimes it was the place a man kept his dignity when the room had no use for it. Near the stage, Grant Holloway was already recovering from the moment with the ease of someone who had never paid for being wrong. He straightened his lapel, tapped instructions into his tablet, and moved through donors with a polished murmur, all confidence and expensive cologne, turning embarrassment into choreography. Not far from him stood Victoria Hale, silver blonde hair swept back, posture exact, speaking to two investors from Dallas beneath the halo of the chandelier that had just flickered. She wore composure the way other people wore jewelry, like something inherited and perfected over time. To her left, her daughter Lily leaned near the dessert table in a pale blue dress and white cardigan, looking younger than the room allowed, tracing circles in the condensation on her water glass, while the adults traded numbers and promises over her head. Elijah glanced once toward the east side of the ballroom again. The temporary lighting rig above the stage gave off a faint metallic tick, almost hidden under the music. One of the mounted fixtures blinked and steadied. Then another answered it. Small signals. Little warnings. The kind the room would ignore until they became expensive. He wheeled the yellow caution bucket farther along the edge of the dance floor, and as he passed the service doors he caught it again, that thin electrical whine behind the walls, higher now, almost nervous. A passing guest wrinkled her nose at the scent. A floor cleaner, and stepped away from him as if decency itself might stain silk. Elijah lowered the mop, drew one clean line through a crescent of melted ice, and lifted his eyes to the chandelier one more time. This time the light did not simply flicker. It shivered. Elijah Brooks had spent most of his life learning the shape of places that were never built for him. He knew the language of service corridors, freight elevators, basement boilers, and supply closets that smelled like bleach and cardboard and damp concrete after a hard rain. He knew how office towers sounded at 5 in the morning before the city put its face on, when the only things awake were the men polishing glass, the women emptying trash, and the low mechanical breathing of buildings preparing to impersonate perfection. Hale Tower had its own voice, and after 11 months on the night crew, Elijah knew it better than anyone in the ballroom knew their own reflections. He knew the soft clank in the north riser on cold nights, the delayed hiss in the steam line near the loading dock, the elevator on the west bank that always paused half a second too long on the 22nd floor. He knew which lights in the executive hallway buzzed before they burned out, and which restroom sink on 31 leaked just enough to stain the marble if you did not catch it by dawn. He knew these things because he paid attention, and because paying attention had always been the difference between getting through a day and being crushed by it. People mistook his quiet for emptiness. That was their habit, not his truth. Elijah had once spent 6 years as an electrical maintenance technician for a public school district on the south side, back when his hands carried a voltage tester more often than a mop. He had loved the work, the logic of it, the way a darkroom could be understood if you were patient enough to trace the problem back to its source. Then his mother got sick. Then the hospital bills came. Then the district cut positions and called it restructuring. Life did what life often did to men without safety nets. It folded skill into survival and survival into silence. By the time he came to Hale Tower, a janitor badge paid more steadily than pride ever had. So he kept his head down, listened more than he spoke, and let people see only what made them comfortable. The quiet one, the black janitor, the man with the mop. Never the man who could tell a strange circuit by sound alone. Never the man who still kept an old multimeter in the trunk of his car beside a winter coat and a pair of worn work gloves. Never the man who sent 3 maintenance notes upstairs in the last 2 weeks after noticing temporary power lines being pushed past safe load for tonight's gala. He had written them clearly, neatly, no drama, no accusation. Auxiliary draw above recommended limit. Inspect east stage panel before event. Risk of failure under sustained load. No one had answered. Or maybe someone had and decided it was cheaper not to care. Elijah looked toward the stage again and felt that same old instinct tighten in his chest, the one that never came from fear first, only recognition. Above the polished laughter and brushed cymbals, beyond the clink of crystal and the easy rhythm of expensive conversations, the building was no longer whispering. It was warning. Near the dessert table, Lily Hale turned at the same moment, one hand resting on the white linen edge, her young face lifted toward the chandelier, as if she had heard it too. Then the lights across the east rig dimmed for half a breath, came back pale, and left the whole ballroom holding still without yet understanding why. Grant Holloway had the kind of face that never looked rushed, even when everyone around him was. His hair stayed in place, his cuff links caught the light at the right angle, and his smile always seemed designed for witnesses rather than warmth. He moved through Hale Tower like the building had been poured around him, stopping only long enough to correct a server's tray position, adjust the spacing of auction cards, or murmur instructions into the headset tucked neatly behind one ear. But beneath the polished efficiency was something colder, something Elijah had recognized the first week he started on the night crew. Grant did not simply rank people. He reduced them. He spoke to executives with shine in his voice, to investors with practiced ease, and to maintenance staff as if they were a problem the room had not yet learned how to hide. He never shouted unless he had an audience. He never used slurs or anything so obvious, too smart for that, too careful. What he used instead was tone, timing, omission, the old clean tools of contempt. He called men by their titles and women by their names, but Elijah was always janitor, as if the uniform had swallowed the man inside it. As if black skin and a maintenance badge together gave him permission to stop seeing detail. Near the center of the ballroom, Grant turned toward a cluster of donors from Connecticut and let out a smooth laugh that landed exactly where he wanted it. The men around him nodded, easy and pleased, their tuxedo jackets sharp as folded paper. One of them glanced toward Elijah, then toward the damp track of the mop across the marble, and said, "Nice to know somebody still believes in hard labor." Grant followed the look and gave a smile so thin it could have cut glass. "Somebody has to handle the background," he replied. "That is what keeps the foreground looking beautiful." The men laughed more loudly than the remark deserved. Elijah heard every word while rinsing the mop head in the yellow bucket beside a column wrapped in winter greenery and white lights. He kept his face still, though something inside him settled deeper, heavier, into the place where old humiliations went when there was no room left for surprise. Across the room, Victoria Hale accepted a champagne flute from a passing tray without really tasting it. Her attention belonged to capital pledges, expansion timelines, a possible new acquisition in Denver, all of it spoken in the low, confident tones of people who believed the future was a thing you could purchase before anyone else touched it. She was not cruel in the way Grant was cruel. Hers was a different failing, more expensive and somehow easier to excuse. She did not notice enough. She noticed balance sheets, guest lists, stock movement, the placement of her foundation logo on the projection wall, but not the human temperature beneath the evening. Not the way a server flinched before Grant reached him. Not the way Elijah became smaller whenever Grant came near. Not the way her daughter Lily had stopped smiling and started listening to the room instead. Lily stood now by the long windows, fingertips against the cold glass, watching the city burn in. Clean white grids below. She glanced once at Elijah, then up at the chandelier, her brows pulling together in the faint, puzzled way children have when they sense a crack adults are too proud to see. At that same moment, one of the stage lights on the east rig dimmed again, then flared back weakly. Grant did not notice. Victoria did not notice. But Elijah did, and when the metallic ticking above the ceiling shifted into something hotter, sharper, closer to strain than sound, he set the mop upright beside the bucket and knew the room was running out of time. Elijah did not move right away. For half a second he stood beside the caution bucket with one hand still resting on the mop handle, listening the way a paramedic listens before touching the patient, not for drama, not for panic, but for pattern. The electrical whine behind the east wall had changed again. It was no longer only a strain. Now it carried a faint, irregular pulse, a stuttering rise and fall that told him heat was building where it should not be, somewhere inside the temporary distribution feeding the stage rig and the extra chandelier wash they had brought in to make the donors look richer on camera. He looked toward the ballroom ceiling, toward the polished brass housings and crystal tiers throwing gold over satin shoulders and polished shoes, and felt that old technician's instincts settle in with cold clarity. This was no longer a maintenance note. This was a countdown. He left the mop standing beside the bucket and crossed the floor, careful but fast, weaving between servers and guests who shifted around him without making room so much as allowing him to exist at the edges of theirs. At the foot of the stage, Grant Holloway was speaking to a lighting vendor in a black blazer, tapping a printed run sheet with one manicured finger while the man nodded too quickly. Elijah stopped just outside their circle and waited for one opening. Just one. But Grant kept talking over him with the smooth, practiced rhythm of a man who believed interruption only traveled downward. Finally, Elijah spoke anyway. "Sir, the East Auxiliary draw is overheating. It needs to be cut back now." Grant turned his head slowly, not startled, only annoyed that the room had forced him to acknowledge the source of the voice. The vendor glanced between them, suddenly interested in the floor. Elijah kept his tone level. "If you shut down the East decorative wash and half the stage specials for 10 minutes, the system may stabilize. If not, you could lose the room." Grant stared at him for a beat, then smiled in that thin way of his, the one that never reached his eyes. "You could lose the room," he repeated softly, like he was tasting the absurdity of it. Around them, the quartet kept playing. A woman laughed too, brightly near the bar. Ice clinked in crystal. Elijah could smell warm wiring now beneath the lemon polish and catered food, faint but real, like plastic beginning to surrender. He did not look away. "I sent 3 notices upstairs this week," he said. "The load is above recommended limit." Grant's jaw tightened almost invisibly at that. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the humiliation more private and therefore more precise. "Tonight is a 7-figure event, Mr. Brooks. We are not dimming a gala because the janitor thinks the lights feel tired." Elijah held his ground. "It is not a feeling, sir. It is the panel." Grant gave a small laugh and turned to the vendor. "Do not touch a thing unless I approve it." Then back to Elijah, eyes cool, tone clipped. "Go finish the floor. That is the only thing in this building you are paid to understand." The words landed cleanly, almost elegantly, and that made them worse. A nearby donor glanced over with polite curiosity, then away again, as if this were no different from a tray being cleared. Across the room, Victoria Hale was still smiling through a conversation she was no longer fully hearing. Near the windows, Lily looked over at Elijah, then up at the chandelier again. One of the East rig fixtures blinked hard enough this time to catch even a guest's attention. A small murmur moved through the nearest tables, then faded when the light steadied. Grant straightened his cuffs and dismissed Elijah with a flick of 2 fingers, already returning to people he considered real. Elijah stood there 1 second longer, smelling the heat inside the walls, hearing the building tighten around itself, and understanding with sudden certainty that the room had just chosen pride over warning. Elijah turned away because there was nothing left to say that the room was willing to hear. The mop still stood where he had left it, a gray handle beside the yellow caution bucket, like a flag no one respected until the storm arrived. He picked it up, dipped the head once, wrung it out, and went back to the floor with the steady economy of a man who had learned how to keep moving while insults still rang in the air. Around him, the gala repaired itself with expensive ease. Conversation rose again in warm, polished layers. A woman near the auction display admired a painting she had no intention of understanding. 2 men by the bar resumed a debate about interest rates, as if the building had not just warned them twice. On the stage, a technician adjusted a cable, and then stepped back with the false calm of someone obeying orders he did not trust. The ballroom smelled of truffle oil, citrus peel, perfume, and underneath it all, only to Elijah, the thin bitter scent of warm insulation. He guided the mop in long, careful strokes along the edge of the dance floor, gathering a crescent of melted ice and a ribbon of spilled champagne into one clear, shining path. That was when he saw the bracelet. It lay near the dessert table, half hidden beneath the hem of a white linen cloth, a narrow silver chain with a tiny sapphire charm no bigger than a raindrop. One of the clasp hooks had come loose. Elijah bent, picked it up gently, and looked around. Lily Hale was 3 steps away, scanning the floor with a kind of quiet urgency that did not belong on a child's face. For For all the money in the room, she looked suddenly very young. Her fingers patted the front of her cardigan, then her wrist, then the table again. Elijah crossed to her and held out the bracelet in his open palm. "I believe this is yours, Miss Hale," he said. Lily looked up fast, relief softening her whole face at once. "Oh, thank you. I thought it was gone." Her voice was smaller than the room, but clearer than most of what had been said in it all night. Elijah nodded and turned the bracelet so the broken clasp caught the light. "The hook is loose," he said. "You should not wear it until someone fixes it." She took it carefully, her fingertips brushing his hand for only a second, warm against skin cooled by marble and air conditioning. "My grandmother gave it to me," she said. "I only wear it on nights my mother says matter." Elijah glanced toward Victoria across the room, surrounded by donors and strategic smiles, then back to Lily. "Nights that matter should not begin with losing things," he said quietly. That made her smile, not the rehearsed social smile she had probably learned for photographs, but something smaller and real. Behind them, the East Rig lights dipped once more, this time enough to drain the gold from the nearest wall for a breath before returning. Lily's smile faded. "Did you hear that too?" she asked. Elijah did not pretend not to understand. "The building is under strain," he said. Her eyes moved to the chandelier, then back to him. "You told Mr. Holloway, did not you?" It was not exactly a question. Elijah rested both hands lightly on the mop handle. "Yes, ma'am." And he did not listen. Lily looked down at the bracelet in her palm, thumb brushing the blue stone. Then she lifted her head with the solemn directness children sometimes carry before the world teaches them to disguise what they know. "My father used to say that the people who fix things are usually the only ones really paying attention." Elijah felt something shift in his chest, small and unexpected. Before he could answer, a sharp tick cracked through the ceiling above the stage, louder now, followed by a brief trembling pulse in the chandelier that made several guests finally look up. And in the cold, bright pause that followed, Lily closed her fingers around the bracelet and stepped a little closer to him. Lily had barely shifted closer when Grant Holloway appeared again, drawn not by concern but by disruption, the way certain men always seem to arrive the moment a room threatened to stop orbiting them. He crossed the marble with that same measured stride, tablet in one hand, smile gone thin at the edges, his attention landing first on Lily, then on Elijah, then on the mop bucket beside them, as if the sight of all three in one frame offended some private design he had for the evening. "Miss Hale," he said, his tone smoothing instantly into something polished and careful, "your mother is looking for you." Near the donor wall. Lily did not move right away. She stood with the silver bracelet closed in her fist and looked up at him with a stillness that belonged more to her father than to childhood. Grant waited exactly one beat too long, then turned his eyes to Elijah. "And you," he said, lower now, sharper now. "I believe I told you to handle the floor, not the guest list." Elijah rested both hands on the mop handle and said nothing. The chandelier above them gave another brief tremor, so small most people would have called it imagination. Grant ignored it with the practiced arrogance of a man who believed denial counted as control. He angled his body slightly toward the center of the room, where a cluster of high-value donors had gathered near the silent auction display beneath a ceiling wash that kept dimming and returning like a pulse under stress. "There is a spill by the Whitakers," Grant said, "and one near the Keller table. You can start there." The wording was simple, but the intent beneath it was clean as a blade. Those were not the places nearest Elijah. They were the most visible. The places where tuxedos stood shoulder to shoulder and women in silk held glasses at chest height, while deciding which cause looked best beside their names. Grant wanted him there, underfoot, in the middle of all that polished importance, bent over a mess while the room watched. Elijah understood at once. So did Lily. "That is not where the spill is biggest," she said quietly. Grant gave her a smile meant for boardrooms and photographs. "Thank you, Lily. Elijah will manage what he is asked to manage." She looked from Grant to Elijah, then toward her mother across the room. But Victoria was still surrounded by donors and handshakes and the bright expensive fog of the evening, too far away to hear what mattered. Elijah tipped the mop head into the bucket, wrung it once, and walked toward the Whitakers anyway. That was the thing about humiliation in places like this. It was rarely loud. It was arranged. As he approached, conversations lowered just enough to notice him. A man with a red pocket square shifted half an inch without making room. A woman in a silver gown lifted the hem of her dress slightly, as if clean water might somehow rise. To meet it, one donor stepped back with his drink, glanced at Elijah's badge, and then said to no one in particular, "Amazing what they expect staff to do in full view these days." His wife answered with a soft laugh that carried farther than she intended. Elijah knelt the mop head to the marble and drew the moisture inward in one smooth line, shoulders steady, face unreadable. Then, from just beyond his left side, another glass tilted. Not much, just enough. A narrow ribbon of amber liquid slipped over the rim and struck the floor near his shoe. It was deliberate in the way cowardice often is when dressed as accident. Elijah looked up. The man holding the drink gave him an expression of mild surprise, so practiced, it was almost elegant. "Oh," he said, "since you are already here." For a second the room hovered there, bright and false, and waiting to see what the quiet black janitor would do with one more insult handed to him like a command. Elijah lowered his eyes to the spreading stain, breathed once through the bitter scent of whiskey and warm wiring, and somewhere above them, hidden behind crystal and plaster and expensive denial, the building gave a harder shudder than before. The next second did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces. First, the chandelier above the ballroom flickered so hard the crystal drops threw broken light across the walls like splintered ice. Then the east rig over the stage gave off a dry metallic snap, sharp enough to cut through the quartet mid-note. The piano stopped. The violinist froze with his bow suspended. For one strange breath, every face in the room tilted upward at the exact same angle. Rich men and servers and donors and children all equal beneath a ceiling that no longer cared what they were wearing. Elijah was already standing before the panic found its voice. He had dropped the rag back into the bucket and straightened with the mop still in one hand, eyes locked on the lights as they surged once, dimmed twice, and then failed. The ballroom went black. Not soft darkness, not candlelit romance. Real darkness, sudden and total, the kind that erases posture and status in the same sweep. A wave of sound broke across the room at once. Gasps, a woman calling out, a chair scraping hard against marble, someone laughing once in that strained, disbelieving way people do when fear arrives wearing the wrong clothes. Then came the smaller noises hidden beneath it all, the hiss of the dead speakers, the low clunk of a distant elevator stopping between floors, the thin electronic chirp of systems realizing they had been abandoned. For half a second, there was nothing but the city outside, its winter grid of white and amber still glowing through the tall windows while the room itself disappeared. Then the emergency lights should have come on. They did not. That was when the panic changed shape. It deepened. A donor somewhere near the auction table said, "Why are the backups not kicking in?" Another voice answered too quickly, "Stay calm." But calm had already left. Elijah could smell it now, the burnt plastic note from inside the walls, hotter and uglier than before, riding under perfume and spilled whiskey, and the sharp mineral chill rising off the marble floor. In the dark, people stopped pretending not to touch each other. Hands found sleeves, shoulders, the edges of tables. Someone knocked over a tray, and the crash of glass seemed enormous. Grant Holloway's voice rose from near the stage, stripped of polish at last. "Everyone remain where you are. Security is handling it." But security was somewhere else, and the room knew it. A child cried out near the windows. Another voice followed, higher, closer, and familiar. "Mom." It was Lily. Victoria Hale answered immediately, but not from nearby. "Lily, Lily, where are you?" The word "where" landed harder than the darkness. Elijah turned toward the sound of the girl's voice, but another noise beat him to it, a heavy mechanical thud from the corridor leading toward the private elevator bank, followed by silence. Then a small frightened knock from behind metal. Not the main elevators. The private one. Lily had been moving toward her mother. She had never made it. Victoria's breath caught somewhere in the room. Someone switched on a phone flashlight. Then another. Then three more. Pale white beams cutting through the black and revealing faces the ballroom had softened only minutes ago. Without the gold wash and chandeliers and staged brilliance, everyone looked smaller. More frightened. More honest. Elijah set the mop against the nearest table and was already moving toward the corridor when Grant's light found him first. Even in the dark, The man's voice still reached for authority. "Brooks, do not touch anything." Elijah did not stop, because now the whole building sounded like a held breath, and somewhere behind the sealed doors of the private elevator, a little girl called out again, much softer this time. Elijah did not slow when Grant called after him. The pale beam from a donor's phone slid across his shoulder, caught the edge of his janitor badge, then slipped away as he crossed the ballroom and entered the darker corridor leading to the private elevator bank. Behind him, the room had lost all choreography. In the blackout, money no longer knew where to stand. Guests who had spent the last hour speaking in polished low tones now raised their voices like everyone else. A woman asked whether the fire department had been called. Someone else demanded generators. Victoria Hale's voice cut through all of it, thinner now, stripped of executive polish and reduced to what it really was beneath the tailoring and the donor lists and the glass tower named after her family. It was the voice of a mother trying not to sound afraid for her child. "Lily, honey, answer me. I am right here." But she was not right there. The elevator doors stood closed at the end of the hallway. Brushed steel turned nearly black in the dark, reflecting only the weak, scattered light from the ballroom behind them. Elijah could hear Lily on the other side now, not crying exactly, but breathing fast enough to make each word catch. "Mr. Brooks, I am in here." The sound hit him in a place deeper than duty. He reached the call panel and pressed the emergency button. Nothing. No light. No tone. The building was still half stunned, systems offline, backup circuits dead. He put his ear to the seam of the door and listened, not just to the girl inside, but to the mechanical silence around her. No movement in the car. No motor recovery. No brake reset. Just a stalled cabin held somewhere by dead power and whatever safety systems had not yet failed. Behind him, footsteps approached at last. Grant Holloway, with 2 security men and 1 trembling phone flashlight, stopped several feet back as if proximity itself might make this his problem. "I told you not to touch anything," he said, forcing command into a voice already fraying at the edges. "Security has protocols." Elijah turned just enough to face him. "Then follow one," he said. "The emergency line is dead." The backup did not engage. She is alone in a sealed car, and the ventilation may be limited. For the first time that night, Grant did not answer immediately. He looked toward the dark elevator doors, then toward Victoria hurrying into the corridor in silver heels that clicked too fast against the stone. Her face had changed. The ballroom smile was gone. In its place was something rawer, older, almost stunned. Elijah knew that look. He had seen it in hospital hallways, on school steps, in waiting rooms where people with money discovered that fear did not honor invoices. He also knew something else. He could have stepped back. He could have let Grant and security and the people who had laughed while he mopped figure it out for themselves. He could have folded his arms and let the silence teach them what it cost to ignore a warning from a man they had decided was beneath the room. For one brief hard second, the thought passed through him, not because he was cruel, but because he was human. Then Lily knocked softly from inside the elevator again, and that ended it. Elijah looked at Victoria, really looked at her, and saw not the CEO of Hale Tower, not the woman framed by magazines and annual reports, but a mother standing in the dark with her heart trapped behind metal doors. He drew one steady breath, turned toward the service corridor, and said, "I am going to the mechanical room. If I can bring one circuit back online, I may be able to get those doors open." Victoria stared at him like she had only just learned his face. Grant opened his mouth to object, but Elijah was already moving, not toward the applause that had never come for men like him, but deeper into the dark where the building kept its truth. The service corridor swallowed Elijah in a different kind of darkness, one the ballroom guests had never been meant to see. Gone were the chandeliers and polished laughter and the clean illusion of effortless power. Down here the tower showed its bones. The air was cooler, touched with concrete dust, machine oil, and the stale metallic smell of old vents pushing tired air through narrow passageways. Red exit signs glowed weakly at intervals along the wall, just enough to turn the cinder block corridor into a tunnel of shadows and dull, emergency color. Elijah moved fast, his work shoes striking the floor with a rhythm steadier than his pulse. He knew this route by heart. Past the linen storage room, left at the freight elevator, down one flight to the electrical access hall, where the real life of the building ran behind locked steel doors, and warning labels no donor had ever read. Behind him, somewhere far above, the gala had become noise without shape. But down here, the building spoke more clearly. He could hear the failed system breathing in broken starts, a distant relay clicking, a transformer giving off that thin insect-like whine that said it was trying and failing to stabilize. He reached the electrical room and yanked the handle. Locked. Of course. Grant had insisted on stricter access months ago after an insurance audit, another layer of control designed to keep the right people looking important while the useful people waited for permission. Elijah set his jaw, reached into his pocket, and pulled out the small ring of housekeeping master keys he had carried every shift for nearly a year. Third key, then the fifth. The lock gave with a hard metallic pop. Inside, the room smelled like heat. Not flames, not smoke, but overheated insulation and dust baked on old metal housings. A narrow battery lantern sat dead on a shelf beside binders no one had opened in years. The main auxiliary panel stretched across the far wall, gray metal boxes, toggle banks, breaker columns, labels half peeled at the edges, all of it lit only by the dim red spill from the hallway. Elijah stepped closer and placed his palm lightly against the casing. Warm. Too warm. He opened the lower access panel and found what he already knew he would find. Temporary event feeds had been patched in without enough load redistribution. Someone had run Glamour through a system built for function and trusted that appearance would hold. One cable sheath had started to soften. A relay module in the backup transfer assembly had tripped, but not reset. That was why the emergency lights had failed. Not mystery. Not bad luck. Neglect dressed up as efficiency. Elijah exhaled once and scanned for tools. None. Of course. He looked down at his own hands, then at the side pouch clipped to his janitor cart belt. The one people joked made him look too prepared for mopping floors. From it he pulled a stubby flathead screwdriver, a pair of insulated gloves folded small, and a flashlight no bigger than his palm. He clicked the beam on. The white circle landed across labeled breakers and heat-warped plastic, revealing the problem more clearly. He could not bring the whole system back. Not quickly, but he did not need the whole system. He needed one live emergency line to the private elevator bank. One door release. One breath of light. Above him, muted by layers of concrete and wealth, he imagined Victoria standing outside those sealed doors and Lily inside them, trying to stay brave in the dark. Elijah slid on the gloves, steadied the flashlight between his shoulder and jaw, and reached for the manual transfer switch. The building trembled faintly around him, as if it, too, was waiting to see whether the man they had called only Janitor could become the one thing this tower no longer had. A second chance. The manual transfer switch resisted at first, stiff from disuse and neglect, as if the building itself had forgotten how to bend in an emergency. Elijah tightened his grip inside the insulated gloves and pushed again, steady, controlled, feeling the mechanism give one hard inch, and then another until it locked into place with a heavy metallic click that echoed through the electrical room like a promise. For one suspended second, nothing changed. Then somewhere above him a relay caught. Another answered. A thin line of current moved through the system, not enough to wake the whole tower, but enough to stir its sleeping nerves. Elijah watched the emergency panel, eyes fixed on the small indicator strip along the side. One red light stayed dead. Another blinked once. Then a third shifted from black to amber. He moved fast, resetting the tripped module in the backup transfer assembly with the flathead screwdriver, holding the warped housing in place with one gloved hand while he bridged the failed contact just long enough for the circuit to recognize itself again. The room answered with a low electrical hum, cautious at first, then steadier, like a body remembering how to breathe after being underwater too long. Above him, the corridor. Emergency lights came alive in sequence. 1, 2, 3. Dim red deepened to pale white. Elijah pulled off one glove, grabbed the wall phone mounted beside the panel, and this time when he pressed the line there was a dial tone. Thin, fragile, but real. He picked up the receiver and called the private elevator bank. It rang once before security answered in a rush of static and noise. Brooks, a guard said, his voice transformed now by urgency into respect he had never bothered with before. We have lights. The mother is here. The child is still inside. Elijah closed his eyes for one beat, only one. I have partial emergency power, he said. Do not force the doors. Use the manual release lever above the frame when I tell you. I am bringing the bank line fully online now. He set the receiver down, moved to the sub-panel feeding the executive corridor, and isolated the overloaded decorative feed from the ballroom stage. The moment he cut it, the system relaxed beneath his hands. He felt it. A strain easing. A burden lifted. The emergency line stabilized. He toggled the final breaker. Far overhead, a brighter current woke. In the corridor outside the private elevator, white safety lights snapped on in a row, washing the brushed steel doors, and the anxious faces gathered before them in a color that told no social lies. Victoria Hale stood closest, one hand pressed over her mouth, the other flat against the seam of the elevator doors. Grant Holloway stood a few feet back, his face drained of all its tailored confidence, his phone useless in one hand. Lily's voice came through the metal again, smaller now, but no longer swallowed by dark. Mom, I see light under the door. Victoria's breath broke on a sound that was almost a sob and almost a prayer. Elijah returned to the phone. Now, he said, pull the release. There was a grunt of effort on the other end, then a harsh mechanical clack followed by the groan of old gears surrendering. The elevator doors opened 3 inches, then 6, then enough for small hands to reach through. Victoria dropped to her knees without caring what it did to her gown and gathered Lily the moment the opening widened. For a second the whole corridor went still, the kind of stillness that only comes after fear loosens its grip. Security helped guide the girl out, but it was Victoria who held her, face buried in Lily's hair, shoulders shaking under the cold white emergency lights. Behind them, the ballroom guests had begun drifting toward the corridor, drawn not by spectacle now, but by relief. They saw the child safe. They saw the lights restored. And then, as Elijah stepped out of the service corridor with one glove still on and the smell of warm metal clinging to his uniform, they saw who had brought the building back from the dark. For a moment no one spoke to Elijah directly. The corridor itself seemed to do the speaking for them. Under the white emergency lights, every polished surface had lost its magic. The brushed steel elevator doors looked ordinary now. The marble floor showed scuffs. The expensive gowns and tailored suits, stripped of chandeliers and flattering gold light, no longer made anyone appear larger than life. They looked like what they were. Frightened people standing in the wake of a disaster that should never have happened. Victoria Hale still held Lily close, one hand spread protectively across the back of her daughter's cardigan as if she could keep the whole night from touching her again. Lily lifted her face from her mother's shoulder and looked past the cluster of security officers and shaken guests until she found Elijah at the end of the hall. Even from a distance, she gave him the smallest nod, quiet and certain, as if she understood something the adults were only beginning to grasp. Grant Holloway understood it too, and that was exactly why his expression had changed. The smooth authority was gone. In its place was a tightness around the mouth, a quick, restless flick of the eyes, the look of a man already searching for a story that might save him. He stepped forward before anyone else could frame what had happened. We need to clear this floor and control the narrative, he said, voice low but urgent, trying to gather his old power around him like a coat. The backup system failed unexpectedly. We will bring in the vendor and review the stage load in the morning. Unexpectedly, a new voice said from behind the crowd. It was Martha Reeves, the senior receptionist, silver-haired, straight-backed, and usually so quiet around executives that most of them had stopped hearing her. Years ago, tonight she was holding a slim manila folder against her chest with both hands, and her face carried none of its usual softness. She stepped into the white wash of the corridor lights and looked directly at Victoria. It was not unexpected, ma'am. Mr. Brooks filed 3 written maintenance notices in the past 11 days. I know because I logged them at the front desk myself. The words landed harder than the blackout had. Grant turned toward her too quickly. Martha, now is not the time. She did not even look at him. It is exactly the time, she said. She opened the folder and drew out 3 copies, each with Elijah's neat block lettering, each stamped received, each dated, each warning that the East Side event feed was drawing beyond safe recommendation and required inspection before tonight. Victoria took the papers with a hand that was no longer steady. The corridor went silent except for the far-off hum of partial power returning to the building one cautious circuit at a time. She read the first page, then the second, then the third, her eyes slowing as the truth assembled itself in real time. The emergency lights sharpened every line in her face. When she looked up at Grant, it was with a kind of stillness more frightening than anger. "Did you see these?" she asked. Grant swallowed. "I saw the reports, yes, but the vendor assured us the risk was minimal and we could not postpone the gala over a theoretical issue." "Theoretical," Martha repeated softly, almost to herself. Elijah stood where he was, one glove still tucked into his back pocket, the other hanging loose from his hand, the smell of warm metal and dust still clinging to his uniform. He did not step forward. He did not defend himself. He did not need to. The pages in Victoria's hand were doing that for him now. Around them, donors and staff and security officers all looked from the notices to Elijah and back again. And for the first time that night, they were not seeing a janitor who had wandered outside his place. They were seeing the man who had warned them, been dismissed, and then saved them anyway. Victoria's eyes moved from the papers to Elijah's face, and when she spoke, her voice had lost the distance it carried in boardrooms. "You tried to stop this." "Before it happened," she said. Elijah met her gaze and answered with the same calm he had used all night. "Yes, ma'am, I did." Victoria stood very still after Elijah answered, as if movement itself might cheapen what the moment required. The maintenance notices trembled once in her hand, then went still. Around her, donors who had spent the evening measuring worth in pledges and pedigree lowered their eyes in a silence that felt different now. Heavier, cleaner, less interested in appearance than in truth. Grant Holloway opened his mouth as though habit alone might still save him, but whatever excuse had risen there seemed to collapse under the white emergency lights. He looked suddenly smaller than his suit, smaller than his title, smaller than the corridor he had ruled so easily an hour earlier. Victoria turned to him with a calm so complete it erased any need for volume. "You ignored written safety warnings," she said. "You dismissed the employee who tried to protect this building, and you put my daughter and every person on this floor at risk." Grant's face tightened. "I was trying to keep the event on schedule. The vendor said the system could handle it." Victoria did not blink, and Elijah Brooks said it could not. She let the words settle where everyone could hear them. Then she handed the notices to security. "Effective immediately," she said, "Mr. Holloway is relieved of duty pending full review." No one gasped. No one argued. The corridor had passed beyond spectacle. It had entered judgment. Grant stood there for one long beat, staring first at Victoria, then at Elijah, as if he still could not understand how a man he had called background had become the center of the only truth left in the building. But he said nothing more. There was nothing left to say. Lily slipped one hand into her mother's and then, after a small pause, reached her other hand toward Elijah. It was such a simple gesture that half the room almost missed its power. Elijah hesitated only because he was still holding the glove he had used in the electrical room, the cuff marked faintly with dust and heat. Then he tucked it into his pocket and took her hand gently. "Thank you," she said, not with the polished gratitude of a child raised among cameras and speeches, but with the plain quiet sincerity that had not yet learned how to perform. Elijah bowed his head a fraction. "You were brave in there, Miss Hale." Lily looked up at him with solemn eyes. "I was scared," she said. Elijah gave the smallest nod. "Brave does not mean you do not feel fear. It means you keep breathing through it." Victoria looked at him then, really looked, not past him, not through the uniform, not around the silence he carried, but at the man himself. "Mr. Brooks," she said, the name careful and clear, as if she understood at last that names were one of the first dignities people like Grant tried to take away. "Thank you is not enough for what you did tonight." Elijah glanced toward the ballroom, where the chandeliers were beginning to return one restrained circuit at a time, their gold light weaker now, humbled by what had happened beneath them. The marble floor still held the tracks of his mop. A caution bucket still stood by a table where guests had once laughed while he cleaned around their shoes. He looked back at Victoria and answered in the same steady voice he had used all night. "I was doing what should have been done the first time." The words hung there, simple and impossible to argue with. No one did. Beyond the corridor windows, the winter city burned clean and bright against the dark, and inside Hale Tower the lights slowly rose again, not as a show now, not as decoration, but as something earned. Elijah stepped back at last, quiet as ever, his uniform still plain, his hands still smelling